I didn't disappear the way people imagine disappearing. I didn't change my name. I didn't move to another city. I didn't cut contact or burn bridges. From the outside, everything stayed exactly the same. Same routines. Same conversations. Same responsibilities carried out on time. That's why no one noticed when I left. The truth is, I didn't decide to abandon my life. I simply stopped inhabiting it. One day at a time. Quietly. Without resistance. At first, it felt temporary. I told myself I was tired. Overstimulated. Emotionally saturated. I believed I just needed distance, not from people, but from expectation. From the constant requirement to react, respond, care appropriately. I thought I would step back for a moment and return refreshed. That moment never ended. The withdrawal was subtle. I still showed up, but I stopped offering myself fully. I listened without absorbing. I spoke without revealing. I learned how to be present in shape but absent in substance. People described me as calm. I didn't correct them. Inside, calm was not what I felt. What I felt was disengagement. Like someone had lowered the volume on my internal world and never turned it back up. Emotions arrived muted, distant, manageable. Even pain felt abstract, as if it belonged to a version of me I no longer accessed directly. I thought this was resilience. I thought I had mastered detachment. What I had actually done was step into a form of internal exile. I remember the first moment I noticed something was wrong. I was in the middle of a conversation that should have mattered to me about plans, commitments, a shared future. I heard myself agreeing, nodding, offering reasonable responses. And suddenly I realized that I felt nothing about what I was saying. No excitement. No resistance. No fear. Just compliance. That realization scared me more than conflict ever could. I began to observe myself the way you observe a stranger whose behavior you don't fully understand. Why did I say yes so easily? Why did nothing provoke a reaction anymore? Why did everything feel equally distant? The answer I avoided was the simplest one. I had stopped caring in order to survive something I never admitted was hurting me. There was no single event I could point to. No dramatic betrayal or obvious loss. Just a slow accumulation of compromises, moments when I swallowed something important because it felt easier than addressing it. Moments when I told myself it wasn't worth the energy. Moments when I prioritized peace over truth. Those moments taught me something dangerous. That disengagement works. When you stop caring deeply, things hurt less. Expectations lose their grip. Disappointment becomes tolerable. You can move through life with efficiency instead of vulnerability. People like that version of you. You are easier to deal with. More flexible. Less demanding. You don't require explanation or emotional labor. You adapt. I adapted so well that eventually I forgot adaptation wasn't the same as belonging. The days became flat. Not bad, just undistinguished. Time passed without texture. Weeks disappeared into each other. I would look back and struggle to recall specific moments because nothing had registered deeply enough to leave an imprint. I told myself this was adulthood. That intensity was something you outgrew. That passion faded naturally. That the muted quality of life was simply maturity settling in. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I remembered how it felt to be invested. To feel urgency. To care enough that choices felt dangerous. I remembered the weight of being fully present, and I realized I had deliberately put that weight down. Not because I was strong. Because I was exhausted. I had reached a point where caring felt like exposure, and exposure felt unsafe. So I closed myself off internally and kept functioning externally. A clean separation. Efficient. Sustainable. Until it wasn't. The strangest part was how invisible the change was. No one confronted me. No one asked if I was okay. I hadn't withdrawn enough to trigger concern, only enough to protect myself. That's the danger of quiet exits. They look like stability. At night, alone, I would sometimes feel a dull ache, not sadness, but absence. Like walking into a familiar room and realizing the furniture had been removed without your noticing. Something essential was missing, but you couldn't name it. I began to wonder how long a person could live like this. Half present. Emotionally outsourced. Existing without fully participating. And more importantly, whether coming back was even possible once you had learned how to leave without leaving. That question stayed with me, unresolved, as I continued living a life that looked intact from the outside and increasingly unreal from within. I hadn't vanished. But I wasn't there anymore either. And I was starting to fear that if I stayed gone much longer, there would be nothing left to return to. Once I admitted that I had left without leaving, I couldn't pretend it was harmless anymore. Detachment had felt like relief at first. Like finally setting down a weight I had carried too long. But relief, when prolonged, turns into something else. It becomes distance. And distance, lived inside every day, becomes identity. I began to notice how little I reacted to things that should have mattered. Good news arrived and passed through me without celebration. Bad news registered intellectually but never reached my chest. I responded appropriately, said the right words, offered support where it was expected, but internally, nothing moved. It was as if my emotions had learned they were no longer needed. That scared me. Because emotions don't disappear when they're ignored. They reorganize. They find other exits. In my case, they turned into fatigue. A constant, low-level exhaustion that no amount of rest could fix. I slept, but never deeply. I woke up already tired, already distant, already preparing to perform another day of normality. People praised my composure. They said I handled things well. That I was steady. That I didn't let things get to me. I smiled when they said it, because correcting them would have required explaining something I barely understood myself. I wasn't strong. I was absent. The breakdown didn't announce itself with panic or collapse. It arrived as irritation. Sharp, sudden flashes of anger at trivial things, a delayed response, a misplaced object, a casual comment that landed too close to something raw. The anger confused me because it felt disproportionate and directionless. It had no clear target. I realized then that the feelings I had suppressed were finding cracks in my control. Leaking out sideways. Demanding acknowledgement in the only language left to them. I tried to reason my way out of it. I told myself that everyone goes through phases like this. That emotional distance was a sign of burnout, not danger. That I just needed time. Space. Less pressure. But the truth was uncomfortable and persistent. I had disengaged not from stress but from myself. I had reached a point where caring deeply felt risky. Where involvement meant vulnerability. Where expressing what I actually felt might have forced conversations I wasn't prepared to have. So I chose neutrality. Again and again. Until neutrality became my default state. The moment that broke something open came unexpectedly. Someone asked me a simple question. Not philosophical. Not loaded. Just a genuine inquiry about how I felt about something important, something that involved me directly. I opened my mouth to answer. And nothing came. Not because I didn't have an opinion. Because I had trained myself not to access it. The silence stretched long enough to feel exposed. I gave a vague answer, eventually something balanced, reasonable, non-committal. The conversation moved on. But inside me, something cracked. I realized that if I didn't intervene soon, this absence would harden. Become permanent. I would age into this version of myself, functional, composed, emotionally unavailable, and one day realize I had lived entire decades without fully arriving anywhere. That thought terrified me more than pain ever had. Pain implies presence. Absence implies erasure. I started noticing how often I avoided moments that required emotional investment. Deep conversations. Decisions that mattered. Situations where I might be forced to take a stand. I told myself I was choosing peace. But peace without engagement is just avoidance with better manners. The nights became heavier. I lay awake listening to my own breathing, aware of a growing panic beneath the calm surface. Not loud panic, existential panic. The kind that asks one brutal question over and over again. How long can you live like this and still call it living? I began to remember moments from my past when I had felt fully present, when choices felt urgent, when caring felt dangerous but alive. Those memories felt sharp, almost painful, compared to the muted existence I had constructed. And I understood something I had avoided acknowledging. I hadn't disengaged because life was too much. I had disengaged because something inside me had been hurt slowly, quietly, and detachment was the only way I knew how to cope without admitting the wound existed. That realization forced me to face a choice I had postponed for too long. Either I stayed gone emotionally, internally, and accepted that this numb version of myself was permanent. Or I returned. And returning would mean reopening everything I had carefully shut down. It would mean feeling disappointment again. Anger. Longing. It would mean risking conflict, instability, and the possibility that the life I had built while absent could not survive my presence. There was no safe option. Staying numb was predictable. Coming back was unknown. I didn't know yet what I would choose. But I knew this much with unsettling clarity: if I didn't return to my own life soon, I wouldn't lose it dramatically. I would simply let it finish without me. Returning didn't feel like coming home. It felt like breaking into a place I had once lived in and no longer recognized. The furniture was where I left it. The routine still worked. The life I had built while absent was intact, efficient, orderly, emotionally quiet. And stepping back into it felt like an intrusion. I didn't rush. I didn't announce anything to anyone. That would have required explanations, and explanations would have forced me to simplify something that was anything but simple. Instead, I did the most difficult thing for someone who had mastered disengagement. I stayed. I stayed present when discomfort surfaced instead of smoothing it over. I stayed with irritation instead of neutralizing it. I stayed with sadness long enough to let it speak instead of converting it into numbness. At first, it was unbearable. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. Tight chest. Shallow breathing. A constant urge to retreat back into detachment. Feeling again was not gentle. It wasn't poetic. It was raw and disorienting, like suddenly hearing sound after years of silence. I had forgotten how loud being alive could be. The emotions didn't arrive in any helpful order. Anger came before clarity. Grief arrived without an obvious object. Longing surfaced for things I could no longer name precisely. I felt overwhelmed by sensations I used to consider ordinary: disappointment, frustration, desire. For years, I had believed that disengagement was control. Now I saw it for what it was. Avoidance. Avoidance had protected me from pain, yes. But it had also protected me from truth. From the knowledge that some parts of my life were misaligned, that some compromises had accumulated into quiet harm, that some relationships survived only because I wasn't fully there to challenge them. Returning meant risking all of that. And I did. Not dramatically. Not heroically. In fragments. I said no where I had always said yes. I allowed conversations to become uncomfortable instead of rescuing them. I expressed disappointment without apologizing for it immediately. Each small act felt like standing exposed without armor. Some people noticed. Some didn't like it. They commented that I seemed different. Less easy. More complicated. Someone even asked if something was wrong with me, half joking, half concerned. I smiled and said I was just tired. That wasn't a lie. I was tired of disappearing. The hardest part wasn't the reactions of others. It was the internal reckoning. Feeling forced me to confront things I had buried, regrets I had never processed, resentment I had labeled maturity, grief I had dismissed as weakness. There were nights I lay awake wishing I could return to numbness. Wishing I could forget what I had remembered. Awareness is not always merciful. But something else began to happen alongside the pain. My days gained texture. Moments stayed with me. Conversations lingered. Time slowed just enough to be felt. I wasn't happier, not yet, but I was present. And presence, I learned, is not comfortable. It is demanding. I had to accept that returning did not mean fixing everything. Some damage had already been done. Some opportunities were gone. Some relationships could not be renegotiated now that I was fully there. I grieved those losses honestly. Not as tragedies, but as consequences. That grief hurt, but it was clean. It moved through me instead of settling into numbness. It reminded me that caring, even late, is still caring. The final shift was quiet. One day, I realized I was no longer monitoring myself constantly. I wasn't checking whether I was too much or too distant. I wasn't adjusting my reactions to maintain equilibrium. I was simply responding. Imperfectly. Humanly. I stopped measuring my life by how little it hurt. I started measuring it by how much of me it required. I understand now that disappearing doesn't always look like leaving. Sometimes it looks like adapting so well that nothing inside you remains unadapted. Sometimes it looks like peace. Sometimes it's praised. And sometimes, it nearly becomes permanent. If there is anything I know for certain now, it is this: you can survive by disengaging. You can function by numbing yourself. But you cannot live that way indefinitely without losing something essential. Returning doesn't guarantee happiness. It doesn't restore lost time. It doesn't erase the years you spent absent from your own life. What it gives you instead is accountability. To feel. To choose. To stay even when staying hurts. I never left my life. But I almost let it finish without me. I'm here now. Not whole. Not certain. Not calm in the way people admire. But present. And for the first time in a long time, that feels like enough.